Hey, welcome everyone. Chris here from VideoMaker. Today we are talking about mastering depth of field. If you are on YouTube and you are watching this, go over to videomaker.com/live and you'll be able to participate in our chat. All you gotta do is put in your email address. That's how we make this free. Otherwise, we'd be trying to charge everyone for it. So make sure to go there if you want to ask questions or whatever. You're more welcome to stay on YouTube and watch it there. But if you would like to actually ask us a question, I'm not going to be fielding questions outside of the first 5 minutes or so of this webinar, so that I can make sure to point you all there. Again, my name is Chris Mullix. I'm the multimedia editor here at VideoMaker. I am going to be your teacher today, and our managing director, Nicole Lajeunesse, is our technical director today, so she will be to my right. So if you see me looking over here, I'm actually talking to her. She's not on camera. She doesn't have a mic, so but she's a little closer than she normally is. Normally she's like 20 feet away, and we, well, you can see our new studio. We got a different setup, so she's closer than normal. So that's kind of cool. I'm going to go jump over and make sure that we're live here. Nothing's started yet here. Looks like I need to maybe refresh this page. Look at that, Chris. All right, so if you are not getting this on videomaker.com/live, just refresh your page and it will show up again there. So what we want to do is we want to make sure this webinar is as give and take as we possibly can. So we want to make sure that any questions you have while we're going on, you're asking them. I want you to ask questions. Even if you feel like it's a dumb question, please ask it, because it's likely that somebody else is watching this is probably feeling that same way, and we're happy that you'd have the guts to speak out. Sometimes it's difficult to do that, and I want to welcome you to please participate in our chat. It'll make the whole lesson a lot better. Before we get started, make sure to type in where you're from in the chat window over at videomaker.com/live. Love to see how far away people come. Usually we have someone in Hawaii, but we've had people in India and all sorts of places. So type in there. That's awesome. Try refreshing the page. Cool. Yeah, Craig, thank you for Nicole for typing that in. Okay, I'm going to check one more time over here at... looks like we're not getting any chatting, although this is not actually live yet on YouTube. Interesting. Are we live on YouTube some other way?
I don't know, but
yeah.
YouTube is kind of supplemental anyway.
There it is. I guess it's just called VideoMaker Live Stream. So I'm going to say, just jump over there and tell people to go.
I can do that.
Okay. Cool. All right. So today is mastering depth of field. It is something that a lot of people struggle with because no matter if you have deep or shallow depth of field, it's something that you want to use to control your storytelling and to direct the viewer's eye. Our next webinar is going to be a month from now in November, and if you are a Plus member, you'll get a recording of this video, so you'll be able to go to our Plus membership page, go and rewatch this video. If you want, you can go to customer service at videomaker.com, email them, and you can get the presentation. But if you're on YouTube or if you're just tuning in, you're not a Plus member, sorry, you're not going to be able to watch this after we're done presenting today. That's the whole catch, and your email, putting that in, is going to be really your admission ticket to being a part of everything here. So there's one thing I didn't have set up, which I should have. And let's see here. Our next webinar is going to be graphic design for video. I really love this. Not everybody that is into video is into graphic design. I happen to really enjoy it. And it's something that I've got a lot of experience doing. Our webinar is really a lot of fun as far as that one goes, and you'll be it'll be on the 20th of November at the same time. It's a Wednesday. It'll be 11 o'clock Pacific time, and we'll be going on from there. Okay, and if you're in the New York area, we are sponsoring the Video Plus part of Photo Plus, so you can get our free tickets. Go to our YouTube page, and there's going to be a link there for you. All right, so let's jump into the actual presentation here and get to it. Type in the chat window what you came here to learn, like something, and how it pertains. So if you want to learn how to do really shallow depth of field, how are you using it, or how are you wanting to use it? So we'll go from there. It looks like Ooh, Portugal, Hawaiian Airlines. Let's see, refresh if you don't see us. Okay, okay, so let's jump right into this presentation here. All right, Mastering Depth of Field presented by myself and Nicole. We're going to be covering 8 different sections here. Well, really 7 with questions on the end. The first thing is going to be talking about what is depth of field, of course. Be a little beginner, but it's always good to go through the rudiments for everyone. And then we're going to talk about why shallow or deep depth of field, so why you would choose one or the other, or why you would even be looking to do either one. And then how-to demonstration of how to get shallow depth of field, how to get deep depth of field, all the different things that you need to pay attention to when doing that, as well as how, what settings you need to use, also to get deep depth of field, which doesn't always mean everything in focus. Sometimes it means a lot in focus, and sometimes you might be using it for other purposes than just having a deep depth of field, and we'll go over that. We'll talk about how sensor size plays a role in how easy or how many steps you got to do to get shallow depth of field. And then we're going to talk about getting depth of field for small sensor camcorders. So really doing some tips and tricks to get that shallow depth of field out of a camera that's really not designed to do that very easily. And then we're going to end with tips and tricks, all the things that we really pay attention to when trying to get the right focus point, and then we'll end with questions. So, but I don't want you to hold out your questions till the end. I want you to ask them as we go, as long as they're pertaining to depth of field. If I get done with this before noon, the whole presentation, and we run out of questions, I will open it up to general questions, and you can stump me if you'd like, and we can play a game of Stump Chris on video production, or just ask any question that you've been struggling with lately, and I'll try to help you with it. All right, so let's jump in. Depth of field explained. So, depth of field explained. It's the area of an image that appears in focus. Shallow depth of field is a small area in front and behind the subject will be in sharp focus. This is your focal point. This is you choosing your focal point on a subject and offering focus on your subject and defocusing everything else. And deep depth of focus, or deep depth of field, is a large area in front and behind the subject will be in sharp focus. And there's a lot of reasons why you need that, as opposed to being able to do shallow depth of field. Shallow depth of field is definitely something that is not as easy to do, or that every camera is able to do it very easily, whereas deep depth of field is typically any camera. You should be able to achieve that. So why shallow or deep depth of field? So why shallow depth of field? So less in focus. You direct the viewer's attention. So less in focus might be a lot of reasons why you're wanting to do that. It might be to direct your viewer's eye, to get them to only look at the thing that's in focus. It's going to minimize the distracting elements in your shot. Now, this is something that might be really helpful. I know I shot a lot of commercials in my past, and sometimes you were shooting in a direction that wasn't always neat and tidy, and shallow depth of field is going to be able to help you hide that into the background, into the blur of the background, so that's real nice. It creates negative space, so when we were talking about our next webinar being titles and graphics, or graphic for video, the negative space is really helpful if you have to put on a graphic or put some kind of titling or what have you. That soft area is always a lot easier to put titles over. They pop, they stand out a little bit better. They're easier to read. You can use it to perfect your composition. So this makes it so that really you can use leading lines and all the rest of the different rules of composition to, along with a shallow depth of field, to really draw that viewer's eye, as well as to lead them into places, and then can be used to reveal something. So in the idea of like a rack focus, where you're going from one thing to another, for suspense, for lots of purposes. It might even be just to get to the next point of your story. So why deep depth of field? So more in focus, easier to keep focus, and good when everything should be sharp, like events in sports. So shooting weddings. Some things, a lot of things, you want them to be elegant. You want to have them stylized. So you're going to be using shallow depth of field. But there's other times when it's an event and it's this thing that's unraveling in front of you, just like a documentarian would need. You might not be able to shoot as effectively with a shallow depth of field because you're having to get to the thing that you didn't know you needed to get in focus quickly, and it might just be better to be able to show everything. If you don't have a purpose for shallow depth of field, it's a good thing to stay away from because it can add more to the active experience of shooting. So in sports, this is super helpful, right? So the cameraman, while shooting an NFL game, watching football, might have to have the whole field in focus because the quarterback's about to throw a Hail Mary across the whole entire field, and they're going to have focus from the 40-yard line all the way into the end zone. And so that's, you're talking, that's 60 yards. That's 200 and something feet. It's a long ways of focus, depth of field. So a deep depth of field is really helpful in that situation because you're not having to track the football or the player or whatnot. But maybe a close-up shot of the players is going to have a shallow depth of field because what's in the background doesn't matter as much. If you're shooting the quarterback and nothing but the crowd and the backfield is behind them, it's not very beneficial that any of that is in focus because there's nothing there that's going to be part of what you're telling in that story, which is, of course, a football game in that situation. Any questions? No. So far, looks like we got some Hawaii, some California, Canada, Grand Rapids. Awesome. Glad you're all here, Minnesota. Glad you all are here. All right, so jumping into, this is why you might use shallow depth of field. Here's an example for narrative story film or just a narrative filmmaking and storytelling. Here you have the tip of the gun is in focus, but the subject, the person holding the gun, is not. I always love to use the Who Shot Mr. Burns story in The Simpsons. That might be Maggie holding the gun. At least it would have ended up being that way. But what I really point out here is that no one really knew who was holding the gun in this situation, other than knowing the complexion of the person behind them. You don't know if they're male or female. That could be an alien, as much as we're seeing here. We just know it's a light-colored thing in the background holding a gun. Maybe it's the abominable snowman. Who knows? So you're using it to reveal the story to the audience, to the viewer, in a way that they don't know who's holding the gun. So you're using it for suspense, but you're also using it to tell the story in the way you want instead of telling them both pieces of information. That might be helpful to show both the person holding the gun and the gun, depending on the scene. But in this situation here, the tip of the gun is important. So who they're pointing it at, or that someone's having a gun pointed at them, really matters. Which prime lenses are best for shallow depth of field, or does it depend on how close you are to the subject? Dog bite 88, I will get to that in a little bit, but short answer is it's not the lens, but the aperture that it has. We'll get to that in a little bit, but it's going to be the speed of your lens, which means the F number, the lower the F number, the shallower depth of field you can obtain with that lens. With some caveats, but we'll get to that, so keep watching. Okay, so here's a scene here from Saving Private Ryan, and you can see Tom Hanks there is in focus. And as they back up, and you'll see some people vomit, and you can see the guy putting in some chew there. This is obviously Normandy on D-Day, so nerve-wracking situation here. But the story is about Tom Hanks. It is about Normandy. It's kind of about the rest of the men in the boat there, but it's not really. We don't necessarily know their names. So who they are, we just want to know, like, that guy's nervous. We don't need to know what he really looks like. So although Tom Hanks is in focus in this whole scene, the rest of the men on the boat are not. So it's showing that not only is Tom Hanks important, so you should pay attention to him, but that the other guys, other than their actions, is not as important as the character, that main character, and what he's going through. And obviously, if they're backing up here, someone's pulling a focus as the camera backs up to keep Tom Hanks in focus, because otherwise he wouldn't stay in focus, and the focus plane, the focal point, would change as they move away from the subject. So here's from Jurassic Park scene. Now, you wouldn't necessarily know that unless I just told you, but here's a guy shooting a gun, and he's obviously not pointing towards the camera. So he's in focus, but you see there's a big negative space there. It's a bunch of green there. You can only imagine, since this is from Jurassic Park, that something is going to show up there. And that's how they're using. This is called a rack focus. So focus from the subject, which is in the foreground, to the background, which is going to be here. Good old T-Rex, and you know, if a T-Rex is that close, you got some problems, right? So the goal here is that he's looking in the wrong direction, right? That we wanted to show, oh, he's closer than we actually thought, or that he snuck up on us, or whatnot. So using focus here is helping us tell the story and tell it in a way that the audience gets revealed just as the person holding the gun is noticing that all of a sudden, uh-oh, good old T-Rex buddy there is right next to him, and he better run. So here's another situation. This is from The Great Gatsby. You can see good old Leonardo DiCaprio there. He's in focus. Obviously, he's our leading man, and he is in the middle of the scene. So not only composition, but lighting here, you can see that he's in focus, and that's an important thing to look at. Although there is other people that are lit as well, but the focus is really the key here in what your eye should look at. And you can see the foreground, what's close to the screen there is out of focus, and what's in the background, what's behind Leo and his I don't know who that is, who he's with, maybe Kate, someone, I don't know. I know Leo, so they're obviously who you're paying attention to, and also you can see that he's looking somewhere, so it's probably going to guide the camera or the audience to where the next scene is going to be. So not only is he important, but where he's looking is important. So really everything else that's in focus, you can't tell the color of the eyes of just about anybody else in the scene other than the two that are in focus. You just wouldn't be able to, because they're not in focus enough, and that they are also delit. Obviously this is not all that big, so you can't tell really well what their eyes color is, but maybe it doesn't matter. But you can see that the focus is being used to make sure you know what to look at as a viewer. And so as a director, you want to guide that, as the cinematographer, you want to guide the audience to where their eyes should look. So what is the need for shallow depth of field? So background of the shot is messy. Like I said before, maybe you're looking towards something and there's a big mess there. So you shallow depth of field and the background will blur right away. So the problem, things in the composition are distracting. So you have a scene, same idea, messy. Maybe it's not that it's messy, but it's something you want to reveal, or it's something that someone would look at because the reveal is really big. So, I think of the situations where you're showing a military man come back home from war, and they're surprising their child. You might not want to show him in the scene yet, because it would be distracting to the viewer, because they'd be able to connect all the dots there, and you wouldn't know why all of a sudden the kid is excited or what have you. Just one little situation you might use. Problem: shot isn't as intimate as desired. So you want to bring the audience closer in, and you want to block off everything else they're seeing, because you want to have an intimacy for the audience to have with what they're looking at. So what you're doing is you're giving them, I don't know about anybody else, but I have a lot of dreams where I can't see everything. I might be able to see part of my eyes or see something, but that's my mind keeping me from seeing what those other things are, and it's keeping this suspense going, right? And so but it also means that I might need to bring something close to me. So in the way of a lot of people with glasses like I am, you might need to bring something close to your face, and that gets it more intimate with your personal space. And so that's the perception you're creating by using a shallow depth of field, especially like say on a close-up. So the need for deep depth of field. Problem: subject is moving from your mark. And this can be a situation where you don't have control of the subject, or that your subject is just not being able to stay on their mark very well. Obviously, if you're working with actors and they're not hitting their marks, that's unprofessional and should be addressed. However, if you're working with an amateur or someone that's not usually on camera or whatnot, you need to work with them. It's going to be difficult for them to all of a sudden be a professional actor. So, work with them, and that working with them might be, I'm going to have a deeper depth of field so that they don't need to worry about hitting their marks as much, because they're having a hard time with their lines as it is. If I'm asking them to walk and chew gum at the same time, I got a problem. So problem here, multiple subjects over a large area. So this might be that you're having, let's see, you have a classroom and you have the teacher teaching the class, and instead of shooting the point of view of the teacher or of the students, you're shooting kind of a profile of both, and you have students all the way across the classroom, and all of them matter. Their interaction with the scene matters, and their reaction to maybe what the teacher's saying matters. So you want to have them all in focus, because you want the audience to be able to have that that feeling and that connection with all of the audience members, or all of the actors in the scene. Okay, another problem. Multiple subject. Okay, subject is moving. So this case might be the quarterback. They're running a play. You don't know what the play is. You're not the coach. They might be close and taking the ball directly from their center. They might be in shotgun, so they're 15 feet behind the center, and you're having to track that person. If you're having to track them, maybe you're going to have a little bit deeper depth of field, so it's easier to do. This is a good trick if you're using a gimbal and you're following someone. If you're using a really shallow depth of field, it's going to be hard to keep them in focus. So maybe open up and make sure your depth of field is deeper, so that no matter what the pull and push of the subject and the camera are, you're able to keep your subject in focus. Make sure I'm seeing questions here. Okay, got no big deal there. And looks like no one's there either. I don't know about YouTube, but if you're on YouTube right now, go over to videomaker.com/live and you'll be able to participate in the conversation. I'm not actually reading comments from there, so that's going to be where you're going to be able to find comments. You're going to be able to ask questions and be a part of the conversation. Again, if you're watching this and you have any input or any questions, please ask them. We want to make sure that you're welcome to engage at any time on the content that I'm presenting here. Okay, so how to get shallow depth of field. Now, this is something that is difficult to do until we got DSLR and mirrorless cameras for videographers. The fixed lens cameras struggle with this, and we'll go over that in a little bit at the end of this presentation. But it's something that, if you're shooting on a video camera, it's not likely you're working with the 3 parts of exposure, which is ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed. So with all 3 of those being a part of it, you then get to control how much depth of field based on the light. So first off, it looks like it was Dogbite88 wanted to know how to get shallower depth of field. Is it primes? Is it zooms? It's neither, or both even. It's really all about the smaller f number. So I have a camera here that I'm going to demonstrate. It's a 50 millimeter. It's an f1.2. That means I can get a super shallow depth of field. In fact, it's enough that if I was shooting myself with it, my eyes would be in focus, but the tip of my nose would not be. So I can get a really shallow depth of field. So that maximum aperture, which is the smallest f number, is going to tell you how shallow you can get your depth of field. Now, you don't need an f1.2. You don't even need f1.8. In fact, f2.8 is still pretty shallow for most situations. So thinking about that, you might not need those that wide of an aperture, but you might not have the ability to increase the amount of light, so you have to use that lower f number to bring more light into your image. But realize that you're going to be having a shallower depth of field the lower your f number is. So to compensate for more light, meaning you're opening up your aperture as wide as it goes at, say, f1.2, the scene would likely be blown out if you were set up at properly exposed. No, it definitely would be blown out if you're at f2.8 and you didn't change anything but the aperture to f1.2. So what you're going to have is you're going to have more light. So what do you got to do to compensate for that more light? Now, or all that light. Now, you can lower your ISO, but maybe you're at ISO 100. So what do I do there? Okay, well, I can just decrease the light level in the scene. So I'm in a studio right now. I could lower because all my lights are dimmable, I could lower the amount of light, so that would work as well. But what if I was outside and I was shooting someone playing soccer, or just maybe a portrait outdoors where I'm using the sun? I can't say, hey, sun, give me some clouds, or dim down a little bit. No, it's just not going to happen. So that's when you need an ND filter. ND filter is like sunglasses for your camera, so it's going to lower the amount of light because you're actually putting diffusion in front of it, or a neutral density filter to lower it. And those show up in stop or quarter stop or third stop increments. And then use a faster shutter speed. The issue with a faster shutter speed is you create something called staccato movement. So everything's going to start seeming shuttery if you increase your shutter speed above double the frame rate. I have a couple questions here from John. When using a lower f-stop, then increasing shutter speed to compensate the light for good exposure, is that bad having such a fast shutter? So John, it creates what I was saying is staccato. So I would recommend, unless you have no other option, is to, if you need a shallow depth of field and you have too much light, like you're outside, is to have an ND filter. We have a variable ND filter here that goes from a third stop all the way up to 4 stops, blocking up to 4 stops of light. So that can usually help you make it so that if it was, say, a f5.6 for proper exposure outdoors, you'd be able to get to that f2.8 or even lower with the same ISO and shutter speed. And then your second question is, I've been sunned before using a faster shutter speed, as that was not what you're supposed to do while shooting video. Yeah, John, you can do it though. I mean, you can do it if what you're shooting doesn't, you don't have an ND filter. What are you going to do? If you want that shallow depth of field, it's what you're going to have to do. The other thing is, of course, just adjust your aperture, and so you don't have to adjust the shutter speed. But the shutter speed is one of those things where you kind of should just go, say you're shooting 24 frames per second. You want to shoot at 1/48th. Some cameras offer that. Most offer 1/50th. So if that's close enough, that's usually fine, or that's fine. And just leave it at 1/50th because that's double the frame rate. And everything above that's going to start creating shuttery staccato movement. It's going to start looking like stop animation. It's going to start looking like you're shooting at lower frame rates, even though you're not changing the frame rate at all. It's just going to cause that staccato movement. So longer focal lengths are perceived to have a shallower depth of field. So to change that, back up from your subject and zoom in, and you'll have a shallower perceived depth of field. And I'm not sure if this slide, so I'll get to that in a second. It's called space compression, and we'll get to that. John, if I haven't answered your question, please chime in again. Otherwise, I'm going to assume I've answered it. Okay, so here's a good example of your different F numbers with a full frame Canon 5D. This is obviously photos, not video, but still it's the same idea. Full frame camera with a f1.2 lens, and you can see all of these shots are all exposed the same, but you're getting a different depth of field from each one of them. And you can see here, you can't even read the words on that chart until you get to, that F14. Now, you can't make out in the background, though, and I know what they are because I shot them as those cases that are in the background. But you can't even start to tell they have handles or what they are even up till F14 there. So this is a 50 millimeter lens, and you can just see how much depth of field you have at all f-stops. So I remember getting really excited, being like, oh, it was my first really nice lens, a 50 millimeter L series Canon EF lens, and it's f1.2, and I was like, oh my gosh, finally. I don't have to worry about noise in my image. I can just lower my F number, and that's fine, except for it really changes the feel of your shot to have very little in focus other than your one little focal point. The other thing is it's hard to keep in focus if you're shooting that, and it might not be the actual feeling. And a lot of the times, I shoot at f4, and I sometimes don't have the depth of field I'd like to have. Assuming you could shoot at 120 frames per second, if your goal is 60 frames per second timeline and you need to, from there, export at 30 frames per second without a problem. I'm not sure what you're talking about, Brad. So if you play back 120 frames in real time and you export that as 24 frames per second, all it's going to do is just grab 24 frames out of a second to export. If you are shooting at 120 frames per second, we're talking about that shutter speed rule. You should be shooting at a minimum of 1/240th of a second. And if you're talking about wanting to shoot half-time slow-mo from 120 frames per second and slowing it down to 60 frames per second, still, and none of your exposure changes. It's all about exposure properly. So I'm not sure how any of that has to do with depth of field, Brad, but I'm not really sure if you're asking a question or making a statement. Please clarify so I can help out. Okay, next slide here. Deep depth of field. So you can see here these two shots. They're both shot at the same exposure. That seems crazy, right? Because the shot on the right appears to have a shallower depth of field, everything's softer in the background, and that's because of what I was saying about earlier, which is space compression. So space compression, what it does is it brings what's in the background closer to your foreground, and what that means is the things that are blurred in the background are now going to be closer so you can see how much blur is there. If we actually looked at these two shots and we scaled up the background of the 24 millimeter shot here on the left to the same as the one on the right, you would see there's the same amount of blur on that background, but you just see so much more of it, so it's perceived as having a shallower depth of field, even though there is no change in the actual depth of the focus area. Brad, that answers it. Cool. Does a bigger sensor mean a shallower depth of field, or does that matter? Dog bite, I have a whole section that's talking about that, and bigger sensor does not equal shallower depth of field, but it does matter. We'll get to that. Okay, so here's lens compression and a really good way of seeing what it does, not only to your subject, but it's doing the same thing to your background. So you can see here, if we look at that 24 millimeter, man, it makes that girl's nose look really big, doesn't it? Same with her forehead and her eyes. They all are elongated because of space compression. So we're not seeing space compression there. Now, the average human eyes, our perspective just walking around is between 35 millimeter and 50 millimeter. 35 is typically about the human eye's field of view, what we see, and how space compression affects our eyes. So that's like more typical. But you can see the background here of the 24 millimeter shot. You can see the ceiling. You can see the top of the backdrop behind the woman. All sorts of stuff is in seen here. Her hair looks flatter and straighter, or not straighter, but like less volume. And you can see as we go all the way up to 350 millimeter, her forehead flattens out, her brow is not as pronounced, her nose is not as big, her lips aren't as big. You can see her hair seems more fuller, and you can see the background is completely the white background, not anything else. And you can see the background through 35 millimeter and 50 millimeter. You can start to see. So if you're doing portraits, portraits or interviews or anything like that, anything above 50 millimeter is what I recommend. You'll have a more flattering look. If you have someone that feels like they're fat, or they are fat, whatever, shoot them with a longer lens, because what it's going to do is it's going to skinny them as the way of people thinking, oh, I have a skinny lens or that. There is such a thing as, adding weight, but it's more of adding weight to a wide shot than taking it away. So it's more like you don't want to make someone look unflattering. You're not likely to make them look skinnier, though you might be able to not make them look as bad, if that makes sense. No, it's not bad to be fat. No, it's more of like
Cultural norms.
well, or what someone's expecting from the shot.
Yeah.
That not anything about culture or anything. Just what was the goal of the actual shot in its first place. Weight matters not at all, other than to your health maybe or something. But whatever. We're not going there. Anyway, moving through. Now talking about dealing with shallow depth of field. So we're talking about space compression. So the wider your lens is, the more things perceived are in focus. So if you are shooting from a wider lens, you're going to have an easier time getting things in focus, because things don't look out of focus as easy. So when you're narrowing your field of view by shooting a longer focal length and compressing the space behind your subject, all those things, that all of that stuff is going to play a role into how easy it is to keep your subject in focus. The compression chart is based off a full-frame sensor, right? Then for crop sensors would have to do the conversion calculation. Brad, no. So whenever you look at a lens, it's always marked based on the 35 millimeter equivalent. So the lens says 50 millimeter. If you're shooting on a cropped lens sensor, you might be shooting at a different focal length because of the crop sensor, but it's still a 50 millimeter. And so we're talking about the effective focal length. So this is the 24 millimeter on a full frame. If you're shooting 24 millimeter, say on a micro four thirds lens that has a 2 times crop factor, I'm going to get into crop factors in a second. To have the same effective focal length of 35 millimeter would be a 12 millimeter because it has a double crop. So 12 would go into 24, 2 times crop factor. We'll get into that a little bit more. It's a little bit confusing, but it will be less confusing in a second. But this is the 35 millimeter. Every lens, regardless of what camera it goes on, is marked based on the 35 millimeter equivalent of what that is. So even if you're shooting on a super small sensor, your lens you put on it says 50 to 105 or whatever it is, it's not that because you have to deal with the actual equivalent. So that's...
I think he had it right in his question.
In his question.
Right, yeah.
Is based off a full frame sensor, yeah, because a 35 millimeter sensor, then a crop would have to do the conversion calculation. If you're using these same lenses on a crop sensor, yes. That, I guess, was what should have been getting to. Is that the same idea to follow for shooting video as well regarding lenses? Yes. Yeah, no matter if you're shooting stills or video, regardless if it's motion pictures or still pictures, the science is the same. The difference you're going to be dealing with is only format-based, not tool-based, which is not camera or anything else. So here's some good quotes from Gavin Thurston, who was a camera operator on the Monkey Kingdom and Bears. We were shooting as near wide open, which means a low F number on their cameras as possible on the lenses to protect that shallow depth of field to really draw the viewer's eyes into what they wanted to see. The tricky part is that you have only a half an inch of focus. So literally all the following focus is on the fly. There's no autofocus. So very few autofocus cameras with autofocus can keep up with a really shallow depth of field. Even the leading cameras, the Canon 1DX Mark II, the Sony A7R Mark IV, or the A9 II, all of those cameras have really stellar autofocus and is great probably at 2.8, likely at 4 always. Like you're going to be able to be money and leave it on, and it's just amazing. And I'm so excited for that when it makes it to all cameras, when that quality of autofocus. But if you have it at f1.2, it's not likely that any camera is going to be able to keep up in autofocus with that. And so it's going to have to be on you to really know the movements of your subject and know where they're moving, know which direction you need to pull the focus on the lens from, and yada, yada, yada. So the next thing he says, at the start of the Monkey Kingdom in particular, so this is about a pro getting better at keeping that focus point on point. I'd say 60% of the rushes were soft, so meaning 60% of the shots that they were trying to get into focus, they didn't get in focus. But towards the end of the production, they got much better. Maybe only 20% was usable. We got embarrassed into getting better. So this is, even pros need to practice. So he credits improvement to patience and anticipating the monkey's movements. So, this is something I remember doing. I worked at a camp. We were shooting what they call the blob, which is just a really big inflatable pillow that one side someone jumps off, the other side someone's waiting, and it launches them into the air. You start to be able to perceive where they're going based on their size or whatnot. Now, I was lucky that everybody was doing similar arcs and going out as far as they have, but I start perceiving and anticipating their movement. And I knew not only how to keep their movement so they could stay full frame into the shot, but also I could keep them in focus. And so that was really, they're getting to know these monkeys and how they move and starting to really understand their space and how quickly they move from one thing to another when they're in different situations or whatnot. So it helped them as they learned about these monkeys, got to know these monkeys, and might even known the personalities of the monkeys to help them with anticipating those focus pulls. And that's something that the same thing is with an actor. It's one of the reasons why some directors work with the same actors over and over again, is they really start to get to know them and how they work and how to best use them. And those things are not only in the performance, but also in them hitting their points, in knowing how they interact with other things, to be able to anticipate what they do so that they can spend less time filming and more time in story. So, how deep depth of field? Because this is, it's really interesting. Everybody wants shallow depth of field, and it's really great to have. And you're all definitely going to get excited the first time you're able to have it, really shallow depth of field on a camera lens. But how much you actually use it or how usable it is more up to debate on what you're shooting and whatnot. Now, how to get deep depth of field is maybe something you don't think of because, well, it's not hard to get everything in focus, but there are some things to deal with. So I'm going to look here. Okay, so is this the same idea as falling? Yeah, okay, I already answered that. So how deep depth of field? Shoot at a higher f-stop number. So if your lens goes to f22, does that mean you should go to f22? Maybe not. Maybe try out some others. You will find the most sharpness in a lens. This doesn't mean the most area in focus, but the sharpness of the lens is usually at f8 or f11. This is pretty universal across lenses, so if you want a really sharp, the sharpest image you can, and it's going to be limited to the depth of field that f number offers you, try f8 or f11. However, if you want the most in focus, having a lens with a really large minimum aperture. So some lenses go to f32, and those are stuff that are likely going to be a much more of a a landscape lens. And those are going to be lenses that you're going to need a ton of light to be able to expose properly. So that's going to mean you're going to either need the sun, and even at f22 outside or f32 outside, the sun might not even be enough light depending on what you're doing there. As well, you might have to increase your ISO, and that really depends on how noisy your camera is and how much you're willing to increase your ISO before you start seeing noise in the image. So, to compensate for the reducing of light coming in, remove the ND, so don't use ND filters. Some cameras or camcorders have ND filters built in. Increase the light, like I said, so if you're outside and it's full sun, if you have a light that's bright enough to bring back outside, otherwise you might have to think of something else. Like I said, raise the ISO or gain. You be careful there, of course, that there's going to be a place where you're choosing noise and light over a clean image. So don't raise the ISO so high that your image looks like garbage from the amount of noise in it. And a slower shutter speed. Although slower shutter speed, anything that you go below double the frame rate is going to start giving you streaks or motion blur. And that motion blur is going to come just like our eyes. When we move our hand really fast in front of our face, we see the motion blur before our hands. The higher the shutter speed, the more samples it's going to take of that hand, and it's going to actually not show that motion blur. So the lower your shutter speed, the more motion blur you're going to get. That motion blur is used well for making the point of view of someone on drugs or someone drunk or whatnot, but it's not always very helpful when trying to get a deep depth of field if you have anything moving. Now, if you have just a big landscape and you don't have anything moving in the scene, yeah, you can lower the shutter speed, but I would say be careful there. And of course, use a shorter focal length, because it's not that you get a deeper depth of field. It's just that the depth of field is not perceived as much because of space compression. So that space you have, that focal range that you have in focus, is not going to be compressed by space. So because of that, it's actually going to be deeper because you're going to be seeing more. I know that's counterintuitive and it's a little mind-bending, but it's just more of that the space compression isn't compressing the amount of space that you have in focus, if that makes sense. So here's a full-frame lens. And this is the same angle as that chart shot, but of this little tiny director's chair here. And you can see that really, being that I shot this shot, I know what's in the background, but you can't really tell what's in the background. You can't tell that the cable is kind of messy behind that light that's on the left. You can't really see all of the stuff that's on the shelves until you start to get to F10. Well, you can see them in f5, but you don't maybe bothered by them. But they start to draw the eye to like what is that? Maybe around f10. But you can see that by f20, most is in focus. But that background is still not in sharp focus. But you can see more of it because it has less blur on it than it did prior. Okay, shallow depth of field demonstration. Give me a second here while I turn on my camera. This is going to be another input, Nicole. And I'm just going to give you guys a quick little thing here. I'm in the studio, and my camera's on autofocus or manual focus. I'm sorry. Nicole, let me know when we're live with this camera.
I had to wait until it turned on.
Oh, yeah.
There you go.
All right, so right now I'm at f1.2. You can see that my shake is more apparent because I'm at a 50 millimeter. I'm shooting in full frame, but in HD on the Canon EOS R with the 50 millimeter f1.2. And you can see in the background, you have no idea what's in the background there. You can see my little toy here, and she's in focus. I assume she's a she, but maybe not. And so if I want more in focus, I'm going to increase my F number. So I'm going to go up to F4. And you can see that the whole scene gets a little darker. So I'm going to increase, because it's 2 stops from where I was at, up to to ISO 400. And you can see that a little bit more in the background, but still pretty shallow. So I'm going to crank it up. I'm going to go up to 3200 ISO, and you can see letting in more light, you can start to see what's in the background, but I'm all blown out now. So I'm going to increase my F number to F8 here. And you can really see what's in the background now. You can see there's a 360 camera there. It's not in focus, but it's there. If you can look really hard in the background, there's a ladder that's there. Let me, if I maybe go up to 6400 ISO, and you can start to see the noise here, and that's what you're getting here. And my focus point changed a little bit, but you can see in the background that there's just all sorts of kind of cables and other things. There's the mic that I'm talking on, and you can see more that's there, and that's really what you're getting. And obviously a static subject, if I wanted to show what was in the background and that was important, I would do that. But likely I'd probably shoot, if this was a human and I was going to do an interview with them, I'm at 1/50th of a shutter speed, and I'm going to probably go to, let's go to f2.8. That looks pretty good. I'm going to move the camera forward just so you can see that it goes out of focus relatively easy. So I'm at sharp focus there. I'm going to back up, and I probably have maybe 3 inches of focal length or area in focus with f2.8. So maybe I'd go to f4 because this person's jittery that I like that, and that's too much. They lean forward when they're telling their story or what have you. So now I'm at f4, and if I back up a little bit, I have almost double the amount of area in focus for them. But obviously space compression is dealing with a little bit. This is obviously really close to me because it's a small toy. But that's that. If anybody has any questions about a demonstration or wants me to demonstrate anything specifically, I'm happy to do that. But I'm going to go back to my presentation now, Nicole. Cool. I don't see any questions there. Please chime in if you have any questions and you want a demonstration here. So now let's talk about sensor size. So Brad, and I think it was Dangbite or Dogbite88. Here we got sensor size. So the crop of a sensor is also known as the focal length multiplier or the crop factor. A lens focal length is based on the standard size of 35 millimeter film. And we're talking old time film, back when there was film. Right? A sensor equivalent to a 35 millimeter film, it is a full frame sensor. Now we're talking about still 35 millimeter film. Not that I don't think it's any different with film, but we're talking about still standards here. A full frame sensor has no focal length multiplier. That means, like I said, if you put a lens on it that says 50 millimeters, it's 50 millimeters. But if I put that same lens on a APS-C sensor, so onto it has let's say it has a crop multiplier of 1. Here we go. And here's an example. The sensor, an APS-C sensor has a focal length multiplier or crop factor of 1.6. To get the actual focal length that you're shooting at, multiply the focal length by 1.6. So 50 millimeter with a crop of 1.6 times has an effective focal length of 80 millimeters. So you're shooting 30 millimeter greater than you were. So if you're wanting to shoot at 50, it's more likely you want to shoot at a 24 or 35 in that area. I'm not going to do the math really quick. I imagine it's probably 35 gets you around a 50 millimeter. But you have to be careful with this because depending on the camera. So I have here that we're shooting on, if I was shooting in 4K, I would actually be shooting a 1.6 times crop on this camera. So know what crop is at different resolutions. Unfortunately, this camera does not shoot full frame 4K, but if I was shooting a full frame camera on Sony, on Nikon, on Panasonic, there would be no crop factor there for me. So you can see here the difference in crop size or the sensor sizes. A full frame sensor is humongous when you compare it to the 3/8 sensor in, say, your phone. You know, your phone's tiny, got a little tiny sensor. And what that's going to mean is the sensitivity of that sensor, the dynamic range, the ability for it to show everything in that with dynamics is really going to be affected. But as well, that focal length multiplier is going to affect the lens there. And so if you have a camcorder with a fixed lens, it's always telling you what the focal length, the 35 millimeter equivalent of it is. It's not telling you what the original lens that you have on it is. It's just telling you what it's actually shooting at. So it's doing the math for you. So you might not have, and it might not be able to open up as wide as you want it to. The small sensor makes it more difficult to get a shallow depth of field. Not sure if you're going to speak on this later, but does faster lens equal better bokeh? A DP and I disagree on this. No, bokeh is... okay, so if everybody understands what bokeh is the defocused area of your, or bokeh, or however you want to pronounce it. And it's the area that is out of focus. This is easiest to be seen in when a area that's defocused is a spot of light. So let's say a Christmas light or any kind of light being emitted, is you see a circle from it. Now that circle is actually the aperture of the camera. So the more blades, the more iris blades that your aperture has, the more round the bokeh is going to be. And so it's going to affect it there. But also the type of glass, if it's spherical or not, if it's, if you're shooting what's the anamorphic lens, sorry, blank there for a second. If you're shooting anamorphic lens, the bokeh is going to be affected by how anamorphic captures and how the lenses are shaped and the optics there. So no, and the thing is there's not really a measurement in quality of bokeh. It's just, if you like nice round bokeh, get a lens with more irises. So the Nifty 50, it's a $50, or no, it's $100, 50 millimeter f1.8 EF lens from Canon. I believe Nikon has one that's $125 for Nikon, and I'm sure that Sony has one too. But as a cost savings, they put less iris blades on it. So it has 5 iris blades. So what that ends up doing is it ends up making your bokeh, the little circles in the background that you see from light, look like an octagon, because the circle of the aperture is actually 5-sided. And the more blades you add, the more round that shape is, and the more that defocused area looks round. So it really depends on what you want, because some people like the elliptical look of the way anamorphic, but some lenses just give you that anyway. It's just part of the optics of how many spherical lenses and whatnot it has, what kind of coatings and whatnot. But absolutely, the speed of the lens plays no role in the quality of the bokeh. However, it will make it so that the bokeh is more apparent because you have more soft areas. Okay, so moving on to this next thing. So we're going to talk about what the different size sensors in examples here. So we see these three shots. They're shot on 3 different cameras with 3 different sensor sizes. The top one is the Panasonic GH4 with a 2.3 times crop. The middle one is a 7D Mark II with a 1.6 times crop, so an APS-C size sensor. And then the bottom is a full frame with no crop factor. Now, all three of these are the same distance from the subject with the same exposure. But these are the same distance but a different focal length. So you can see that we had to change the focal length depending on the size of the... So 50 millimeter on the Panasonic had to be a 27 millimeter to get the same framing. But you can see here, the one on the bottom, when you see that, you go, well, Chris, you're lying. The bottom one is a full frame lens or camera, and look at how much... more blur there is in that shot than the GH4, both at f4. What's the deal? And this is where space compression makes a difference. So is where it comes to play. So here is the same focal length, but different distances from the subject, but with the same focal length, right? So they're all at 35 millimeter now, but they are different distances from the subject, and you can see space compression happening here now, right? So the space compression is bringing that chart closer when shooting on the GH4 because of the smaller sensor. The middle one, same thing, it's getting a little bit closer, and it's really elongated there on the full frame. So nothing's changing here other than the sensor size. And then lastly, here is all three with the same focal length and distance from the subject. So, and the same exposure and everything, right? And as you might see, there's less sensor to capture. So what the Micro Four Thirds sees there looks like a close-up, right? It's because it is. It's actually a longer focal length because 35 millimeter times 1.3 times is a larger, that's I'm not going to do the math really very quick. It's going to be like 90 or 85 millimeter or something like that versus the full frame, which is really shooting at 35 millimeter because there's no crop. So it's a much wider field of view. But here's that thing when we were talking about, it looks like the shot on the top has a shallower depth of field than the one on the very bottom, right? But how would that be? They're all shooting at the exact same focal length, same exposure. The only difference is the sensor size. So you go, well, Chris, yeah, absolutely. The sensor, but wait a second. The bottom one is shallow. What's going on? Well, if we zoom in and we crop the shots from the APS-C and the full frame to match the Micro Four Thirds, we have this setup here, which now you can see, other than resolution loss, because we had to actually zoom in on the shot, they all have the same amount of softness, and the space compression is exactly the same. These three shots are the same exact shot as these three shots, just to match the top shot, and they all are the same. Now, you see a little bit of softness on that bottom one because we actually lose resolution because of the cameras that are here and the resolutions they were shot at. But that they're all exactly the same space compression and the same amount of softness. So the larger sensor does not mean you get a shallower depth of field. However, it does mean it's easier to get a shallower depth of field at all focal lengths. So you didn't have to back up from your subject. You might not have to, you don't need as much space to make up for the crop factor of the lens. You just blew my mind. For years, I've read this and never really got it till now. I'm glad, Brad. It's really interesting. I made these, and I shot all this stuff when we first got in this building, so 3 or 4 years ago. Doing this exercise taught it to me. Like I got it wrong. I always thought, no, larger the sensor, the shallower the depth of field. And the answer is no. It's easier to get a shallower depth of field, but it doesn't mean you get any more shallow of a depth of field. Okay, so now let's jump into the depth of field for small sensor camcorders. So if you're shooting on a camcorder, here's some ways to deal with that. So use space compression to your advantage. Now what you want to do, because there's not you can't get a shallow depth of field from your camcorder. Instead, use space compression to make it seem like you have a shallower depth of field. So zoom in and get further from your subject. And increase your aperture because you're going to need a lot of light. So increase it as much as you can there. I shot a commercial. It was a lawyer's commercial for a guy that was a spokesman. Have you been injured in an accident? And we had nothing but a camcorder, and they really wanted that film look. And so, no joke, we were 100 feet from our subject, getting them as a close medium shot. to make it so that we had and then of course there was a lot of distance between him and the background as well. So the distance was compressed and it gave us a lot shallower depth of field in the image, or it appeared to have a shallower depth of field than if we shot him closer. We brought the camera closer to him and shot wider and showed more of the background. So tips and tricks. Here, let me make, what time is it, Nicole?
You're right at time.
I'm right at time. Okay, so start thinking of your questions because I'm right at noon right now, so I'm probably not going to get into stumping Chris. But here's the tips that I give you for dealing with shallow depth of field. There's such a thing as too shallow. You might get excited at having f1.2, even f2.8, but most things are not shot that shallow. I think it's far more valuable to have a zoom lens that has the same aperture across the full focal length of the camera or of the lens than I do it having a lower f number. And especially on mirrorless cameras that tend to be able to shoot above 1600 ISO up to about 32 depending on the camera, and some cameras above 6400 ISO. But because of that, you're not needing the aperture to be able to open for more light. Rather, you can use it to just control your depth of field. Trust is in the eyes. If you're shooting someone, make sure the eyes of your subject are in focus on their point. Because if their eyes are not in focus, now maybe you're using this, and use this if you're using it in a narrative film and you're trying to make it seem like this guy's shifty, or the subject's shifty. But if their eyes are not in focus, as a human, or maybe actually it's cultural as well, when people are wearing sunglasses, this is why people don't take off your sunglasses and look at me in the eye, because they believe that trust is in the eyes and that your eyes won't betray what you're saying. Now that's complete bull, and people can learn how to control their eyes, and card players do it all the time, and they try to do it, so it's not really true. But we kind of have it instilled into us that our eyes are where trust is. So it's real important to have the eyes in focus. Focus. Identify your focus point and keep it in focus. It's key. If you have a squirmy subject, whenever you can, check your focus. Looks like it just ended.
It says it's live still on Video Maker.
And it says it hasn't started yet.
Could it have to do with scheduling? Because it says you're still live according to Sling.
Yeah.
Should I just shut live off?
Yeah.
Oh.
You're still live. Okay. Brad, at telephoto lens, we can still hear you. Oh, awesome. Okay. Well, I'm just going to answer this and hope that it's still working well for everybody else. You're there, but you're not. Yeah, well, I checked out already. Okay, so question was, is there any accessories you recommend for getting a shallower depth of field for iPhones? It's going to be all about space compression, so use a telephoto lens. That's going to help you because it's going to give you more perceived depth of field. Actually getting more depth of field out of the camera, the lens is fixed, so you only have the aperture they give you. Now you're gone. Okay. Space compression is going to be the only way. Any more questions? I'm just going to keep talking out loud as well, just in case people are here. This is really weird. It's timing right, but yeah, it was right at noon, but they don't, and there's not a end time. That seems silly to offer that. Start time, yes. Maybe on YouTube still? Weird. Well, I'm going to talk to the camera because I just typed it in there. Thank you all for tuning in. We really appreciate you here. We hope you learned something. We'll be doing a next webinar next week, or next month, I'm sorry, on the 20th at 11 a.m. And yeah, we'll be going then. So keep doing the hard work you do. I'm going to check out chatting here just for a second, make sure no one else is here, no one else has some questions. Nearly done. Thank you. Appreciate you all being here. Until next time, keep doing the hard work you do. It's so anticlimactic, but
Yeah.
whatever.
So